Greybees is one of the most powerful novels you can read about war and how it destroys the lives of ordinary people. The beauty of the novel is its understated way of narration and thoughtful imagery. It was written by Ukrainian author Andrei Kurkov in Russian and wonderfully translated by Boris Dralyuk. In this episode, we speak to Boris Dralyuk about translating Prose as a poet, editing Andrei Kurkov, and the novel Greybees. Boris Dralyuk is the author of My Hollywood and Other Poems and the translator of Isaac Babel, Andrei Kurkov, Maxim Osipov, and other authors. His poems, translations, and criticism have appeared in the NYRB, the TLS, the New Yorker, and elsewhere. Among many other awards he won, he received the 2022 Greybees Translation Prize from the National Book Critics Circle. Formerly editor-in-chief of the Los Angeles Review of Books, he is currently an associate professor of English and creative writing at the University of Tulsa. He holds a PhD in Slavic languages and literature from UCLA, where he taught Russian literature for several years. You can buy Greybees using the link given in the show notes. Welcome, Boris. Welcome to our podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm very glad to be here.
Now, you were born in Odessa, Ukraine, and please tell us about Odessa and its people.
Well, I'm very glad that you began there because that's of course where I began. And in some ways, although I left long ago when I was 8 years old, I really never left. I still feel that I dwell with one foot in Odessa, and the reason for that is that it made an amazingly deep impression on me. The city was uniquely diverse, uniquely active under Soviet rule. It was on the very edge of empire. It also was on the very edge of the Russian Empire, and so it was far from the centers of power. And some of the most famous, of course, writing about Odessa is concerns the activity of less than, let's call them, ethical people, gangsters and shysters and people looking to make a quick buck, as we say in the United States. And I think that spirit of ingenuity, the entrepreneurial spirit, and the slight bit of danger that kind of lingers in the air, those were very, very important for me when I was a child. I really enjoyed that atmosphere, and I continue to enjoy it when I translate work by Odessan authors. I should also say that the city was historically had a very large Jewish population, and because it's a relatively new city in that region, it was founded in the late 18th century. Unlike some other major centers of Jewish life in Eastern and Central Europe, the Jews were there from the start, and so I come from a Jewish family. We felt much more at home in Odessa than perhaps we would have felt in other parts of the Soviet Union.
Were there any influences in your formative years towards literature, poetry?
Certainly. I mean, I think one of my first memory of an encounter with poetry. Now, my mother read poems to me all the time. It's very typical in Eastern European and Central European households to read poetry to children at a very young age. So I was exposed to poetry before I was conscious of it as poetry. But my first sense of what a poet was I think I have a very distinct memory of this. I was sitting in a little library, which is not far from our house, which is of course at the time a Soviet library, a communist library, and there was a mural on the wall. And on the mural was this enormous, beautiful, well-shaped man in a sailor's t-shirt, and he had a bald head, and he had one hand placed on his heart, and the other hand thrown back as if he was claiming something of great importance. And that was a portrait of Mayakovsky, of Vladimir Mayakovsky. Now, I have, I have mixed feelings about Mayakovsky as a poet, but it was very important for me to see this, the very size of him as a poet. It created the impression for me that poetry was something worth shouting at the top of your voice. And that was my first kind of heroic experience understanding the role of poetry in the world.
Could you tell us about your first experience of learning English?
Sure. Yes. Yes. So as I mentioned, I emigrated with my family at the age of 8. Before we left, this was 1991, and at this time, many people were leaving the Soviet Union as refugees, and we were part of that wave of refugees leaving the Soviet Union. Um, uh, the life in Odessa became more dangerous than it had been before. The economic system was collapsing. Everyone sensed that the end was near for the Soviet Empire. And a lot of people, this being Odessa, took advantage of the situation and offered English classes to people who were soon to immigrate. And I was enrolled in one of these classes. The class was obviously taught by people who did not speak English. I mean, that was clear to everyone within 5 minutes. But they kept us there for an hour, and what they managed to do was to teach us hello, the word hello, and then they had a little book, a little guidebook of the United States, and they taught us all the state flowers of the states to which we plan to immigrate. So I learned the word poppy, which was the state flower of California, and that was my first taste of English. When we finally did immigrate, when we landed in Los Angeles, I realized that my vocabulary was insufficient. But luckily, at that age, at 8, 9, our brains are sponges, and I was able to soak up through television and through school. I was able to soak up quite a lot of English quite quickly.
You were brought up in Hollywood.
That's right.
You lived there for a long time.
I lived there for some 30 years. Yeah.
How did it shape your literary temperament living in Hollywood?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and I think we probably would need more than an hour for me to tease out a proper answer to that. But what people uh, often don't understand about Hollywood unless they live there is that it really is a small town. It feels like a village, although it's the capital of entertainment for the entire world. At the same time, it's a place where people live very ordinary lives, and I think that for me, the mix of grandeur and uh, self-aggrandizement with this steady daily life that I saw around me, the contrast between these two things, the regularity and the mundane nature of life in Hollywood, contrasted with the great image of Hollywood in the world, those that contrast is very poignant and interesting for me. It continues to inspire my poetry, and um, I feel like the message that I want to give the world about Hollywood is that it's a real place where people live, and every place has its own myth, and every place has its own reality, and we do justice to a place when we are able to depict both the myth and the reality.
So, is My Hollywood and Other Poems is your first published book?
My first book of poems, my first book of original poems, absolutely, yes, yeah.
So, what was the theme?
I think it's elegiac. I don't know whether there's a real uh, 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 central theme, but if I were to say a few words about the contours of the thematic contours of the book, it's really a book about honoring what is gone, what is what has been replaced, what has been effaced, and doing a little bit of monument building to things that don't usually merit monuments.
So, from poetry to translation, when did you decide that you want to get into translation seriously?
Well, I think that decision was made for me when I was a teenager. Um, when I was a fresh immigrant, when we had just arrived, I was really quite embarrassed by the fact that I spoke another language. I really wanted to forget everything that I knew about Russia and everything that I knew about the old country, and to plunge directly into the mainstream, to be accepted as a proper American. And so I neglected my Russian for a few years. But when I turned 13, 14, I realized that I was actually uh, uh, doing myself no favors. That in fact Russian was a great resource, and I should brush up on what I knew and build on it. But I didn't know exactly how to go about doing it because there were no classes in the language, obviously, at my high school. And I asked my mother. My mother said that I should read poetry. Now, the reason she recommended poetry was that Russian has dynamic stress. So when you encounter a word on the page, you really don't know where the emphasis falls. You can mispronounce it very badly if you've never heard it pronounced before. And with poetry, most poetry written in Russian was written in metrical forms, so that the words had to fit a set of stresses, and that gave you a clue as to how the word was actually pronounced. And so it was very good advice on a practical level because then I would know not only what a word meant, but also how it was to be spoken. Uh, but as soon as I started reading, I fell so deeply in love with the poems that I encountered that I began almost unwittingly, almost without intent, translating them, trying to find English phrases that matched the beauty of the Russian. And I did that because I wanted to share them with some of my friends, these poems, and I've been translating ever since.
Being a poet, do you think it makes you more sensitive towards reading and translating prose?
Yes, I think so. I think I'm not sure whether it makes me more sensitive, but I think that my sensitivity probably makes me both a poet and a translator who pays close attention to the rhythm of whatever prose I'm translating. I have a very um, uh, almost painfully uh, uh, sensitive ear uh, for language and for the rhythms of language. And until I get a phrase exactly right, both in terms of its sense but also in terms of its music, I really can't go on. And I think that that works very well when translating a short poem. It makes translating prose a lot more difficult at the first draft stage, but the results are probably at least a little bit better for people like me. It may not matter to most readers, but readers like me, I hope, will appreciate the amount of work that goes into the translation.
Especially when we don't read the original.
Yes, yes, exactly.
We don't know what kind of a rhythm that you are transporting from Russian to English.
That's right, and you have to be able to trust the translator to do something. Yeah, exactly, to do something special.
Poetry is more of instinct.
Yes.
You get into that mood, probably you start writing and you finish it.
Hmm.
But when it comes to translation, you are trying to be very careful reading the original. And it's more of a, I would say, if I may have to use the word, it's a meditative deliberation. Is it not a dichotomy?
I love that question. It's a very interesting proposition, and I think that there is some truth to it. But I would also argue that when writing poetry, at least the way that I write it, and it's not, it doesn't hold for every poet you'll ask, but certainly for me, I found this to be the case. I am deliberating uh, as I write. So yes, there is an instinct, and there's also the discovery of putting words down on paper, not knowing exactly where a poem will lead you. Um, uh, and even if you do know where the poem will lead you, part of the trick of writing a good poem is making the reader feel that the poet did not know where the poem was going to lead her, and so uh, uh, nonetheless, despite all of these elements of instinct and uh, subconscious discovery, there's also the process of deliberation. And when translating, Similarly, but in the other direction. Although deliberation leads, that's the first approach. You really are deciding how to get something right very consciously. There are moments where you make a decision to phrase something in a certain way, if it's a departure from the original, and you don't know, you cannot explain to yourself in the moment why it sounds right. And that's exactly how poetry works as well. You can't explain why this is right, but you just know it. Your brain came up with something, your mind came up with something that fits in mysterious ways the context. And then later, days later, sometimes years later, you'll look back and you'll be pleasantly surprised by the deeper meaning of what you put down on paper without knowing that meaning.
It's wonderful answer. Wonderful answer. Tell us about your mentors, teachers, collaborators who have had a great impact on your literary life.
Well, there were three collaborators, teachers who were most instrumental. The first was Michael Henry Heim, who was a great translator from a very large number of languages into English. And very luckily, when I was about, I would say, 16 years old, I was reading a major magazine in school. I think it was the New Republic, and there was a brief review of a work translated from Serbo-Croatian. What was at the time Serbo-Croatian, and uniquely for the period, this was the 1990s. The name of the translator was right there in the review with a few complimentary words about the quality of the translation. At that time, many reviews of translated literature didn't even name the translator, much less say anything about the quality of the translation. But I was very impressed. It was the first time I had seen a translator's name in lights. And then I discovered that Michael Henry Heim happened to be teaching just 20 minutes away from my high school at UCLA. So I applied to UCLA with the express purpose of working with Michael Henry Heim. I even wrote my admissions essay about translation and about Heim in particular. And on the first day of classes, although I didn't have a class with him, I came to his office. I found his office. I knocked on the door. He beckoned me inside. I came inside uh, uh, his room, and I was very nervous. I was stuttering, just stuttering the way I am now, tripping over my words. And I said, I'm a translator. And as soon as he heard me say that I was translating already at that age, his eyes lit up, and he asked me to show him what I had brought, my samples. He moved his chair to my side of the desk, and we sat there for 2 hours looking over my translations. I was 18 years old. And of course, I was hooked from that moment on. To be taken seriously as a young artist, well, it just meant the world to me. And so he was very, very important for me for the first, um, 5, 6, 7 years of my professional life. And then I was lucky enough to, through correspondence, simply by sending a letter out into the world, to meet Robert Chandler, who became and still is, my the central collaborator of my translating life. Together with the poet Irina Mashinsky, he and I edited the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry. This is something he didn't need to, he didn't need to invite anyone to do it with him, but because of his remarkable generosity and his remarkable commitment to the art, regardless of who the artist is behind the art, to talent. He will discern talent without any prejudice. You could be 12 years old or you could be 70 years old. As long as you're doing good work, he will appreciate that work. So he saw something in my work, and he drew me out and involved me in his circle. And I've been a grateful satellite ever since. So we've been working together quite a lot and continue to work together. The third major mentor in my life is the great American poet Dana Gioia, who also plucked me out of obscurity as a poet. Somebody I also met through correspondence when I was editing the LA Review of Books. He happened to submit something that he needed to see published rather quickly. If I were to accept it, I both accepted it and made sure that it was published in the proper format. And then we began to correspond. And since then we've been in constant touch. He's become a very close friend, and is by far the most perceptive critic of poetry that I've ever encountered. A person who can look at a draft of a poem and ask just the right question to turn the poem around, to 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 change the course of a poem. If it's taking a tailspin, he will right the plane and make sure that the poem comes in for a good landing.
Your stint as the editor of the LA Review of Books, and you also worked at Times Literary Supplement.
Yes, I've been contributing for, I think, probably over 10 years now, or just about 10 years to the Times Literary Supplement, and I was the editor in chief of the Los Angeles Review of Books for about 6 years, and uh, both experiences, both on the editing desk and as a frequent contributor of reviews, um, uh, have taught me that good critical writing is as tightly constructed, as carefully built as a poem. You know, especially when you're given a certain number of words to work with. If you're given an assignment to review a book at 400 words, you have to include a lot of information in a relatively tight space, but also not only choose the things that are worth saying, but to say them in a way that it doesn't feel like you're cramming the information into this tight space. So, so the challenge of having flowing, artful prose relate a lot of vital information in a short space is not unlike the challenge of writing a good poem. And I approach my reviews, although of course nobody reads reviews like they read poems, but I approach my reviews as a poetic challenge.
The parameters for reviewing translation, will it anyway differ from parameters for reviewing an original?
The reviewing translations, you know, usually what I do is I treat, for most of the review, I treat both translations and original texts quad text. I treat them for what they are, for what I have in front of me. But then but if it happens to be a translation, and especially if I speak the other language, then I do try to say something about the quality of the translation, and even perhaps look closely at the original text to make some comments about the decisions that the translator made. And in cases where it's a retranslation, that's even more interesting, because then what I do is I try to read the original, but also the preceding translations, and judge the decisions that both of these translators, or all three of these translators, have made, and why the new translation either succeeds or doesn't quite succeed.
No, for a reader like me, probably who never gets to read the original, because I won't be knowing the languages anyway. So, it's a standalone text for us, right? So there is no way we can understand whether the book failed because of the translation or because of the original. That we'll never be able to judge. Is it possible, actually?
What you should do is you should just judge the book in front of you. Read it as if you were reading an original, because you will see things in it, if you read it that way, that are either successful or unsuccessful. Just the other day, I was recommending a book, and I'm not going to say which book it is, but it was a translation, and I was reading this translation just to see whether I could recommend it, and without even looking at the original, I knew that something had gone terribly wrong on the first page, and it just didn't make any sense. It didn't hang together, and okay, it's possible that the original is also nonsensical, but chances are, if you see something that has a glaring logical error, or a word misused in an unproductive way, then the problem is with the translation, not the original.
You teach Russian literature.
Yes, right now I'm actually teaching English and creative writing, so mostly creative writing courses. But I have taught Russian literature before, and I plan to teach it again.
Basically, teaching. You are into teaching literature, right?
Yes.
So you must have had some interesting experiences interacting with youngsters.
Yes, I have.
Can you narrate a couple of them?
Well, I'll tell you one experience that has stuck in my mind as um, a, a marker on my journey, my professional journey. Um, in Los Angeles, I have a very close friend who's now in his 90s named Oscar Mandel, and he's a poet and a longtime, a great writer, and of both nonfiction and fables and plays, and he's also a longtime professor of literature at Caltech. When I was a very young instructor, when I was a graduate student, I reached out to him, and we struck up a friendship. And every other week or every 3 weeks, we would gather in Westwood, which was the area around UCLA where I went to school. We would gather for lunch, get together for lunch, and uh, we usually had lunch at a diner where no one else ate. It was a completely empty restaurant, and it was very cozy and convenient to be the only customers at this diner. And one day, when I was in my third or fourth year of teaching, I was having lunch with Oscar and telling him how important his friendship was to me and how much I had learned from him. And at that very moment, a student, seemingly out of nowhere, came out of some booth and approached ours and said, "I remember your class," to me. Uh, I'm still thinking about that poem we read together and trying to figure it out. And I really, really appreciate your planting something in my head that I'm still thinking about. And he thanked me for the class and said it was one of his favorite classes. And to have Oscar witness that was for me a wonderful moment because it was a passing of the torch. You know, it was two generations of teachers and two generations of students. Yeah.
Absolutely. You are reading and translation, reading of books and translation. How interdependent are they?
My reading and well now because I have twins and they're very active and demand a lot of time. I don't get to read as much as I used to. And so right now my reading and my translation are very, very closely dependent because I tend to read what I'm translating and very little else, although I try. I start a lot of things but don't finish a lot of things. Uh, and but generally speaking, I've always plucked from my reading material, like a magpie. I've always collected phrases and idioms and syntactic patterns that I thought might come in useful, might come in handy when translating. And so everything I read with a kind of mercenary eye, looking for things I can use later.
Prose versus poetry translation. Do you approach them differently?
Not especially, no. I think that what translating poetry has taught me that is in fact very useful when translating prose, because I translate largely metrical poetry with rhyme and meter. Um, I am forced to take certain liberties in order to get at the um, both the music as well as the sense of the original. So by virtue of the resistance of the material, virtue of the fact that I'm working with to try to fit a very tight structure, I am forced to take liberties, and that is very freeing. It has taught me that sometimes one has to depart quite a long ways in order to get something right in the English. Uh, and I bring that same attitude to the prose. Instead of being slavish, instead of making sure that every word in the English is placed exactly where the word in the Russian or the Ukrainian is placed, I'm able to look at the whole picture and decide how to craft a sentence in English, regardless of where the words go, that communicates in a better way the message of the original.
When we compare Russian and English while translating it, this departure from the original, there is bound to be some departure, right? In some sense.
Yes, bound. There's bound to be. Yes.
Language wise, from Russian to English, where are they going to occur most?
So I think that syntax is where they're going to occur most. I think that there are some translators of Russian uh, prose and Ukrainian prose who adhere very closely to the syntax of the original. But I feel that that is it may work sometimes, but very often it has the opposite effect. Instead of producing the same emphases, it actually changes the meaning and changes the emphasis. Because the most important words in a sentence of Russian, the most important word may be at the end of a sentence, not at the beginning. And in English, the most important words can be at the beginning of the sentence rather than at the end. And we know how to read these sentences in whatever language in which we're reading them. We know where to look for the important words. We know where the rhythm takes us. It either takes us up or it takes us down. So if you're transposing a sentence from Russian into English, it may look like the words are arranged in the same way, but the rhythmic pattern of the words is completely backwards.
One of the things that you said, while translating, you have to respond emotionally to text, not intellectually.
I think that if you fall in love with a text, if it has an effect on you, if it changes the way you feel about yourself, about the world, if it produces an effect on you of that kind, then you are going to be more committed to translating that word. And also, you're going to be attending to the effect of your translation rather than just the words on the page. You're going to be conscious of the fact that the original moved you in some deep way, and your aim will be to move readers in that same way. So what you'll be attending to is not just some kind of fidelity on the page, but fidelity to the experience of encountering the work.
Now we will come to the book Greybees. It's very, very entertaining. Entertaining in the sense you won't get to stop anywhere. Maybe a single sitting or two sittings you would like to finish the book. That is the first part of it. That is the power of the way it is constructed, the beautifully constructed. Not much of action there, right?
No.
It's more of contemplation of the narrator. That's Sergeyevich. Now, on the other hand, once while you are reading the book and also once you finish it, it is a multi-layered text. In fact, my reaction as a reader,
Yes.
when he is talking about the title Greybees, I think he's talking about the whole humanity, not just the narrator and the other characters there. In fact, I was mentioning to you the other day, we interviewed Dr. Hamid Ismailov. He coined a wonderful phrase which I have never heard before called fluid identity.
Mm-hmm.
See, in a sense, we don't have any strict identity. If you take me, I have different identities.
Yes.
So when you finish the book, you start thinking really, should we have an identity? Will it cause more, distress? It's all the wars that we are seeing right now, currently, right?
Yes.
They are all about identifying yourself with the land, identifying yourself with the language.
That's a very, very, very provocative and interesting idea, and I appreciate it very much. I think that Andrei set about writing this book precisely because he wanted to put on the page uh, the experience of people who do not see themselves as anything other than who they are in the place where they are. They don't think of themselves in reference to meta narratives and big narratives about uh, the direction of history or of national boundaries. They think of themselves as living at a certain house on a certain street in a certain village. That's their identity. And they find meaning in their daily chores, their daily encounters with the world. And uh, those people, unfortunately, are often the ones who suffer silently when people come through with their big narratives trying to impose one or the other. I know what you're saying, and to me, when you look at the suffering of the people in Gaza, when you look when you or when you look at the suffering of any people who did not who are too young to have chosen any path in life, uh, or who never really gave much thought to anything other than their daily struggle to survive and to have some joy with their family or to do their jobs well. When those people get swept up in these conflicts, it can't help but break your heart. But so few of those people uh, have voices. Those are not the loudest voices in the room. They're not the voices that we hear. The voices that are amplified generally are the voices of political leaders or fanatics on either side. So we hear constant barrage of fanaticism and constant barrage of dogmatic purity here, there, and everywhere. Um, but we really, shouldn't lose sight of the people who don't have strong feelings one way or the other. They're simply being victimized by these larger forces. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people displaced in any country. There are several million people in Ukraine were driven out. I don't think that any of those people were expecting a war. They didn't care for the war. The war came and found them. And I think the people who are being displaced from their homes in Gaza, they didn't ask for this, and it was brought to them. I don't really care who brought it to them. I'm much more horrified by what has been brought.
The author Andrei Kurkov. Interestingly, his mother tongue is Russian, and he writes in Russian. And this book is about suffering in Ukraine because of the Russian intervention. Please tell us about Andrei Kurkov and other works, and as a writer.
Yes. Well, Andrei is definitely one of my favorite writers, and one of the writers to whom I feel closest as spiritually. And, we don't see the world exactly the same way, but I always learn something from him. And I don't think anyone sees the world exactly the way he sees it. He has a truly original eye. And I've come to know his work very well because this is not the first book that I've translated of his. I very much hope it's not the last. In fact, two more books of his I've already translated. They're going to be published next year and the year after that. And Andrei was indeed born in Russia, but he grew up in Ukraine. He uh, uh, started writing during the Soviet period, but he didn't really begin to publish until after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So his career was very much a Ukrainian career in independent Ukraine. And Ukraine was, a bilingual country. It remains a bilingual country. The position of Russian culturally has, of course, shrunk and been sidelined by this current invasion, which is ironic because, of course, the whole plan on the part of Putin was to protect the Russian speakers. But the people who suffer most, in fact, are the Russian speakers. The regions that have faced the most bombardment are regions populated by people for whom Russian is probably their most commonly used language. And Andrei was politically and in terms of his daily affiliation, a, a Ukrainian person. He sees himself as a Ukrainian citizen. His life is tied up with the life of Ukraine, and his works are about Ukraine. Nonetheless, the language in which he thinks creatively is Russian. It's the language in which he feels most comfortable creating text. And so he's not, unlike some other authors who have switched to Ukrainian, he's going to stick with Russian for at least the time being because it's the language in which he feels he can create with most freedom. That's how our minds work. There's one language that dominates, and it's the language in which we can be most creative. And for Fante, that's Russian.
Now, there are certain things in the book. When he talks about silence, the description of silence, it is such a powerful writing.
Oh yes, I agree. The way he differentiates between different kinds of silences, you know, because silence is what we accept it to be in a war zone. You know, silence is a different character from the silence of, let's say, a summertime field, where the silence is filled with all kinds of buzzing of insects and the rustling of leaves. And during the war, the silence may be filled with distant gunfire, and so it's silence has different meanings in different contexts.
And in spite of the shelling that is going on,
Yes, exactly. It becomes background noise.
and again, Sergeyevich not having a calendar to look at.
Because what's the point? Life just drags on.
He is only worried about light coming in and light going out. That's the only thing matters to him.
Exactly.
Without saying much, by writing these things, he was able to just make you feel, as a reader you really feel it, right? You don't have to say anything about it.
There are these little details, experiential details. Yeah.
And again, about the food also, it's very interesting, the way food, it describes a lot about, maybe he's a foodie, I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, he certainly likes a good meal. Who doesn't? Yeah. No, he's yes, but he puts a lot of love into his descriptions of especially the Tatar cuisine and the borscht. Yeah.
Again, he not only about the language, divide the language creates, divide the land creates, and he also talks about religious practices, especially in the third part of the book.
Absolutely. A it's not an ethnography. It's just these are real characters who happen to come from a real place and from a distinct culture. And I think he captures that very well, that culture very well. And of course, Tatars are facing enormous discrimination right now and are being arrested and kidnapped to Russia and put on trial and sentenced to very long terms for doing absolutely nothing.
I don't know whether it is intentional or not. There is a dish called samsa.
Yeah. Well, it actually exists, but I know that there's a kind of a Kafka-esque semi-reference, but it actually does exist. The dish does exist. They're like little stuffed pastries, and very common in Central Asian cuisine and in Tatar cuisine. But of course, I think those little coincidences are very typical of Andrei. He likes to sneak in his allusions sideways. Yeah. So there is something very Kafkaesque about Sergej's existence, of course.
Yes. And one of the inspectors, he named him as Ivan Karmazov.
Yeah, Ivan Fyodorovich. Yes. Well, yes, and I think that since the start of the war, uh, uh, there's been a move to uh, not necessarily rid Ukraine entirely of everything to do with Russia, but certainly to lower the place that Russian authors have occupied in the canon in Ukraine, because those authors were imposed from above, and Dostoevsky is one of those authors. Now, however, Andrei Andrei understands, uh, Andrei understands the quality of Dostoevsky's work, of Tolstoy's work, and all of this. He's not a fanatic who's never going to touch anything Russian again. But during the war, uh, authors can be, especially dead authors, can be used as weapons of war. Uh, People start competing. Well, our authors are better than your authors. What did you ever do that's anything, like Dostoevsky or Tolstoy? And so Andrei makes one of the characters in Dostoevsky, who is the most logical of the brothers. He makes him an FSB agent. I think that's quite nice. And now I'm not even sure he intended to do it, but I think it works very nicely. Yeah.
Now, before we end the conversation, please read a paragraph in English from the book.
So this is a passage I really love, which sees Sergej for the first time leaving his native village. He left behind him a war in which he had taken no part, in which he had simply happened to have found himself dwelling. Yes, he had been a resident of war, an unenviable fate, but one far more bearable for people than for bees. If it weren't for the bees, he wouldn't have gone anywhere. He would have taken pity on Pashka and not left him all alone. But bees don't understand what war is. Bees can't switch from peace to war and back again as people do. They must be allowed to perform their main task, the only task in their power to which they were appointed by nature and by God, collecting and spreading pollen. That's why he had to go, to drive them out to where it was quiet, where the air was gradually filling with the sweetness of blossoming herbs, where the choir of these herbs would soon be supported by the choir of flowering cherry, apple, apricot, and acacia trees. At the next checkpoint, he was held up for 3 minutes, no longer. All they did was look at his passport and the piece of paper he had been issued with. Then he stopped twice more in response to warning signs of increased road control. There too everything went smoothly, and 2 hours later his headlights picked out a large sign on the side of the road. You are now entering the Zaporizhia region. There was nothing particularly cheerful in these words. They didn't promise to fulfill some secret childhood dream or anything, but as soon as the sign was behind him, tears welled up in Sergej's eyes, as if a great weight had fallen from his shoulders. He glanced down at the speedometer and pressed the brake pedal again. Don't rush, he told himself, and stared with tired eyes at the deserted road, which was well lit by his high beams and bordered on both sides by apricot trees, the usual companions of southern Ukrainian drivers, beside which, in 2 or 3 months, anyone who wasn't too lazy or had no other gifts for their kids would stop on their way home. They would stop and pick up ripe orange apricots from the grass, 3 in a bag or a cardboard box, and 1 in the mouth.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time, Boris.
Thank you, Daniel. This was wonderful.